Hello, everybody, and welcome to this episode of Nick's podcast, The Empty Waiting Room. My name's Steve Tomkinson, and I'm the CEO of Disruption Works. We look at using technology in disruptive ways to transform the way we operate our organisations. Now, I'm delighted to introduce Nick, whose podcast it is. Let us tell us what we're talking about.
Thanks, Steve. The Empty Waiting Room is the title of my book, which I published last September. And it's based on a lifetime working with people who have complex social needs and with the organisations created or mandated to support them. And in the book, I argue for a radical change in the way we deliver public services to this group of people. So for me, this is a timely podcast at the beginning of a new government, and it takes some of the key themes from the book and develops them further through conversations over 5 episodes with some of the great people I've had the pleasure of collaborating with over my lifetime, particularly in the last 10 years. In this first episode, I'm going to talk about starting on a journey of change. And in conversation with Ben Emm, my mentor, friend, and self-time critic, and with Steve Tomkinson, it surveys the key events and experiences that have shaped the way I approach my work and what principles guide the way I structure all the assignments I do. And I'm indebted to you, Steve, for offering to record and edit this podcast series for me. Thanks for doing that.
Oh, no, absolute pleasure, Nick. And I just hope everybody enjoys the episode. Thanks very much.
Well, anyway, just say welcome everybody to this first episode of my podcast based on the book The Empty Waiting Room. And I'd say it's based on my lifetime's work and research. In effect, it's a kind of manifesto of change that argues for a different way of delivering public services.
Yeah.
One that's more in tune with the community, one that's more customer focused, one more attuned to what recipients actually want of that service. The title of the book comes from work I did with a group of probation officers in Sussex who argued that the task of all public servants, in essence, is to help people get the resources they need. In other words, to empty the waiting room. And that's where the title came from. Now, I first met Ben, who's my guest today. Welcome, Ben. 25 years ago, when doing this work in Sussex. And then since then, Ben's been my constant friend, colleague, and has been instrumental, Steve, for me, through many conversations over a meal or a glass of wine, helping me to shape the ideas and convictions presented in this book. So, Ben, I'm really delighted that you've agreed to be my first guest. And in this episode, what I would like to do is really take a kind of helicopter view, really kind of explore some of the broader themes in the book. And then in future episodes, I'm going to drill down with other guests into specific areas. But so I guess, Ben, do you want just to introduce yourself and say something about your background, perhaps how we met, and then we'll kind of get us into the theme of the book, really.
Sounds brilliant. Thanks ever so much for having me today, Nick. My background was originally in the probation service, and I became a chief executive of probation trust, and then ended up in the civil service as a senior civil servant advising ministers, and then put all of that behind me and became an independent management consultant and spent 10 days working in exactly the type of issues that you're talking about now, really how to try and improve public services. And you and I, as you say, have known each other 25 years. You've done work for me, we've done work together, and we've certainly both valued deeply conversations over lunches and checking out each other's thinking. So great to be with both of you today. Thanks.
Thanks, Ben. So perhaps a way of getting into this conversation is, you were really good, Ben, in reading the drafts of the book for me, commenting on them, and kind of helping me reflect and pick out the key issues. And so from your perspective, Ben, what do you think are the key standouts from the book? What particularly kind of floats your boat, so to speak, and kind of gets you thinking about different ways of doing public service?
I think I was struck by a number of things, and you read the book at one stage, and then obviously the world moves on, and you start looking at it through different lenses. And if I suppose I give you my latest take, because we're speaking after we've had the most recent budget, we've also got thinking from the Shadow Chancellor, and we've got a landscape in front of us, which is very much about there being not enough money for the type of public services that we would really all want to have. And these conversations ongoing in government circles about the need for greater efficiency, which often makes those of us who worked in the public sector wince in agony, because efficiency isn't always sort of what it's made out to be. And so I've come back to your book most recently, and I've looked at it through that lens, and I'm very struck by several things, really. I immediately leapt on the idea of creating self-organizing behaviours, that sense of how do you empower individuals to try and find solutions, because we're still talking very much about top-down solutions from government and efficiency savings and driving programs. And I think Nick and I know that that's not really the way that you get the best out of frontline public services. I'm also very struck, and it's been a large part of the theme of Nick's work over many years, of the need to collaborate far more broadly and widely than we ever have done before. We tend to do thinking in silos, which are often determined by the shape of government departments, and it doesn't easily lead to sort of cross-departmental connectiveness. And yet on the ground, the complexity that Nick talks about in his book is that, you know, one person's probation client is another person's patient, is another person's social work client, is another person's addiction client, and somehow somebody on the front line has to pull all of that together. And I'm just struck, really, I suppose, that there are a number of themes in your book, therefore, that seem immensely pertinent now, because you're beginning to articulate that there's going to have to be a different way of doing things. And I think your book speaks very much to me about that. Does that sort of fit the sort of space that you were aiming at?
Absolutely. I mean, you know, Ben, from my work, particularly in Sussex, we were in the days when probation services were still given a lot of freedom to determine the way they delivered the services, the shape of those services, as long as they met the outcomes, which, you know, allowed us to work with probation officers to design the way they could best deliver the services to their communities. You know, I really recall the stunning results that got just by allowing people, in which managers themselves weren't dictators. They weren't over focused on the numbers, but on coaching, supporting, enabling people to get out there, and only really having to intervene in a managerial way, if I can put it that, or in a compliance way, when people kind of went off piste. But as long as they stayed on focus, delivering the outcomes, and it was really creative. And you know, I remember those days kind of both with fondness but with sadness, because actually, you know, you have to go now to some really small community organizations that, for example, I'm now working with in the Southwest, to really be able to get that same ability to organize in a way that's best for the community and not dictated from top down. So but as you say, coming back to, you know, to a time when we don't have a lot of money, you know, and that people are talking about we need to do public service differently. My real worry at the present time is that it's still from this top-down thinking. And instead of actually thinking, actually, if we design from the bottom up, we'll get better results. And what I've learned over my working life is not only are they better, they're also cheaper. And I can point to pieces of work that I've done. Piece of work I did in Brighton with people that had physical disabilities and some learning disabilities to create their own model of care and support in a housing scheme. Um, and first of all, we went through the phase of actually they couldn't believe that they were being given the opportunity to do this, to self-organize, if you like.
Yeah.
And once we helped them to do it, and we did it, and they worked out what would help them best in their lives, whether it was in their, their social care, their physical care, their community engagement, and so on, or personal care. Actually, when we put the budgets together and they chose it for the 10 people that we were working with, it produced a 36% saving to the local authority budget on those 10 people. And my view was, well, if you replicated that across the whole organisation, you would have enormous savings. And of course, what happened was like many initiatives, it didn't then get repeated. But it was a success in every single way. And I think, if we're to get good public services, then we need to return to that type of model and actually not to be scared of it.
I do completely agree. It's very difficult because I've worn different hats, as we've said, over the years. And when you're leading public services, that comes with the challenge of accountability. And that means you need to measure things and you need to hold people to account. And at the same time, sometimes we're then talking about the best results come when you set people free. I'm always very struck, and you'll know this as well from work you've done, that when you do work in the private sector, you can often have a very high level strategy, but then in a way the leaders kind of get out the way and let people get on with the how do you get there, in order to actually make sure that the ultimate outcomes are achieved. But people tend to find the most efficient way to do that. So there is a balance and a tension, but it seems to me we've got really no choice going forward. We can't keep applying this top-down way of thinking, which I've been an exponent of in my role as a chief executive. I've probably come full circle to realise we're going to have to find a way to recruit people well, train them well, and set them free to try and achieve some of these things, whilst finding a new way to hold them accountable for how they do things. Because at the end of the day, this is public services, and you and I know that in some of this, people's lives matter.
Have you both of you come across the fact that actually sometimes it happens by default because people are under so much pressure to get something done? So people on the cold face are actually going, I have to find a solution to get this done, and I haven't got, that isn't available to me anymore, that isn't available to me anymore, that isn't, so I've got to go and do something else to make this work with
Steve,
little or no budget, but it's got to happen. So they're already doing this in some part to actually deliver a service anyway.
Certainly in my experience, yes, Steve. And I think there's a choice, isn't there, for the leaders in terms of saying, no, hang on, stop, and go back to the way we'd defined. Or actually, in the really best organisations, you go, hang on a minute, you may have found a different way to do this.
I've seen it with, so we do some work with Age UK, and their partners are all independent charities actually, but they deal with an area, and the medical professional referrals in, they aren't kind of official routes to, as a care plan, if you like, to release somebody from hospital or something like that, but they're a very good replacement for that if somebody can get the care and support they need from the charity, as opposed to it being the public health organisation, the local public health service, because they haven't got somebody to go around and look for somebody, do some befriending, make sure they're not lonely and things like that. They haven't got that. Whereas the charity has, and that's all they do is that for older people, So,
and I think that's a really important point, Steve, because what I'm not arguing for is in talking about working from the community upwards, that everything is delivered by small organisations. It is a partnership between the bigger statutory organisations and community organisations in the way you describe. And actually, what I don't think we do at the moment is the emphasis isn't enough on that partnership with the community groups.
Yeah.
It's still too top heavy, if you like, and
Yeah.
it's about redressing that balance so the Age UKs of this world and all sorts of other charitable bodies actually are able to contribute in an effective way and are properly funded to do it.
Yeah.
Because part of my um, belief is that actually, okay, you may have to increase funding to some of the voluntaries,
Yeah.
but actually what that will do is decrease more than proportionately the funding you need to then put in as part of the core.
Well, very
Uh,
much so, because that's their specialism. So, like the HUK partners we work with,
yeah,
they help older people, and in all sorts of different community and social ways. And some of it's health related, but some of it's just literally social, and just
yeah,
supporting them to make sure they don't end up back in hospital because they need some support in a minor way that is just forcing them back into the system again. So the
yes,
saving is huge, really.
yes,
Little
and it's and I think
lean
that.
kind of fund.
Sorry, Steve, go on.
No, that's right.
Yeah, okay. I I think Ben as well. Just touching on the points about governance, which I think you were making earlier, is that my experience of that is that part of the work that I've done over the time is working with leaders to help them feel free to take those jumps and those risks. And
Yeah.
I've seen that happen. We recently, well, I say recently, post COVID, did some work with a large local authority we do a lot of work with, helping them in terms of reframing what their family centres do.
Yeah.
And they asked us to go out to the community and find out how they'd coped during COVID in terms of social and health issues and so on. And they were all saying to us, well, social services disappeared during COVID, health services disappeared. So actually, we organised ourselves and
Yeah.
perhaps using churches or other voluntary groups. And actually, in future, in the family centres, we'd really like to have a say in the running of them because we believe we're as good in terms of commissioning and setting the spec as public servants who aren't involved in this.
I,
And interestingly, the commissioner agreed and actually worked and said and made it clear in the specification to the providers of the family hubs that actually you have got to involve the voluntary groups in this. It's not a choice, and X amount of funding will go to the voluntary groups.
well, I was going to ask you about that because I think I know one of those things you've always done so well is actually talk directly to client groups and make sure that their voice is heard. And I'm struck as we try and clutch for solutions going forward that sometimes part of the problem is the way in which services are commissioned is that they can be in a way too tightly defined, partly for the reasons of accountability, but almost in the process stifling innovation, but also not allowing enough of that client voice
Yes.
to be heard. And I think there are again messages at various points in your book that commissioners need to hear as well about being prepared to think differently, to specify differently, to empower, to have that overall strategy for
Yes.
direction at the
Yeah,
beginning,
absolutely.
but
Yeah.
then in a way not to fill too much of the middle of that space with detail and constraint.
And I think the other important part of that story about the family centres was that the commissioner was prepared to work with the concept that I use of researching initial conditions. In other words, they were prepared to say we need to spend some time getting this story,
Yeah,
otherwise we'll commission the wrong thing again.
yeah,
And I think that's something I make very clear in my book. You want to rush, many public services want to rush to do things, which is understandable. I think the other point from what you were talking about earlier, Ben, was that often, and I've seen this before, that I think it was either you or Steve referred to the frontline practitioners, that they're given almost something that they know is undeliverable.
Yeah.
And they are very good at working around. Many of them are really good at finding very creative solutions with what they've got, rather than waiting for direction. That works well sometimes, but it's better when they're empowered to do that rather than do it despite. They do it because, if you see what I mean.
I think I have come to that conclusion, which is a shame to have realised it almost after I stopped working. But the reality, I think, is that you sometimes want everything to be terribly nice and very well defined when you're running an organisation. You want a clarity and a cleanness about your processes. And actually, and it's there looming large in your book as well, all of this stuff is actually a bit chaotic and a bit complex. Yeah. And actually, people are probably okay finding their way through that on the ground if you will let them do it. And you have to live with the fact that it's a bit untidy, so long as it probably, and so long as you can guarantee, I guess, that it is actually delivering the outcomes that you want. We don't have phrases like there are multiple ways to skin a cat without good reason, do we?
And I think that's the link with governance. Governance is, for me, about defining the principles and the boundaries to that work, so that people don't feel out of control, which is different from working with chaos.
Yes,
they're two different things. Chaos theory, which you'll see, there's a scientific theory underpinning my work, is based. Chaos theory isn't about being all over the place. It's about iterating on a set of principles. And I think I'd also like just to take you back, Ben, to the time you were a chief officer and you commissioned me to do some work with magistrates.
Yes.
And actually, I think you're slightly you're being slightly unkind to yourself, because I think you did allow that initial research around conditions to find out what probation officers thought, what magistrates thought, and you gave me the space and time to talk to them. So I think you did embody that in your work. So I think you're being slightly.
Thank you. I'll take the compliment whilst I had it. But I think the point is, though, I know I probably didn't do enough of that, and I think that's the message I would love to pass on to leaders now. That for all of the pressures and challenges on them, they're going to have to find different ways to do this going forward, and the solution has to lie in partly getting people to do things differently, and partly, I suspect, in technology, because we're moving into that bit of the world now where technology is very, very different from when I was in the world.
Yeah, and I think that's the bit, Steve, that I'd be interested in your comments on, from the point of view, in terms of public sector reform. A lot of the talk is about using AI, artificial intelligence, as finding literally intelligent ways to do things more efficiently. And I suspect from my conversations with different public sector groups is they're not against that in its proper place. But I think there's at present we're scared of it. We're scared of that technology and how we partner with it in a way that still puts the human relationships that are important in public services, they still remain central. So the technology is the servant rather than the master.
Yeah, I mean, that's the point. I mean, the point is it's a collaborative arrangement, and we struggle now to recruit people because we've seem to have a labour shortage of particular skills and things like that. People, since post-COVID, don't want to do the menial jobs. They want to do something that's probably a little bit more interesting or a bit worthy or a little bit, suits their life better or whatever it may be. So call centres, all that kind of stuff is really difficult to recruit for in quality, certainly. And there's lots of areas of these types of places that can be automated without losing anything. The simple process, if you just want to order a new bin or something from your council or something like that, why should a person be looking at any of that part of that process? The person at the other end who's having to order the bin doesn't want to do that. They want to do something else. It's just not what they want to do. So if you automate that process, they'll thank you for it, and it won't be a problem if you deliver it properly. And it's a very simple process, and it's a very simple thing. But I had to order a new bin the other day, and that's why it came to mind. And I literally had to email the local council to get a bin. Somebody at their end had to pick their email, read it, go, what do I need to do? Oh, I need to book a bin delivery for X, and this is where it is, and approve it, and all this type of stuff. There's some process that somebody's had to do. Why? I should have just filled a form in, and it just go, and it just arrive, and that somebody, whoever delivers the bins, just delivers a bin, because that's the process. That's not really a technological solution, it's a process solution.
Yes.
But if you go back to like the AI conversation, which is a bit bigger, imagine a phone call. You can't phone your council because you won't get through, and you'll be on the phone for half an hour to get through to somebody. If you're doing that, or certainly NHS 111, all those types of things, but if you can triage that call to take all the simple ones away that are literally question and answers that an AI can answer very successfully now, to a level which is easily demonstratable, easily repeatable, easily governed, all those processes, to the point where then a human has to take over. If you can do that, you would save something like 60 to 70% of inbound calls based on that stuff. That's a lot.
Yes.
That's huge.
It is, and actually, Steve, that's a very powerful statistic, because you can also phone an awful lot of public service numbers at the moment to be told that we're really sorry, due to unprecedented demand for our services, the call waiting time is enormous, and that erodes faith and trust in those organisations and in our public services. If you can make that a more humanized experience by diverting people that don't need to speak to an actual person, that really would be very powerful indeed.
If you're just moving house or something, or you're doing something mundane anyway, that a lot of the stuff that you contact somebody about will be mundane, and you just get it done, and it's done in the time that it takes you to talk to a bot, and it's done, then you don't care that it was a bot at that point, because you as the user has got it done, and that's the process. But
I think the question I'd want to ask, Steve, and there's clearly a lot of benefits to it. I suppose, as you and I found with some work we tried to do with a couple of public services 2 or 3 years ago, trying to sell the benefits of it. So it's getting that across to reduce the fears and the kind of some of the elements in that. For example, with older people, who irrespective of how human and efficient you make the process, the fact they pick up a phone. I know my dad's like this. He's 96. He keeps being asked to go online to things. Well, he wouldn't know how to work an internet, and it's not worth teaching. So I suppose my question is, how do we sell it, and how do we transition into it, Steve?
Well, the point, and we're down to this commissioning thing again, I think, is the fact that this is not being commissioned because the commissioners aren't necessarily looking for it or at it, because they're not necessarily aware of it, and that's fine. Or they don't know how far along it's come, and they're waiting for somebody else to do it before they do it. Well, everybody's doing that, so it never, you're then waiting quite a few years until it's been proven somewhere else, and it's just in general use. Well, that's a bit late if you've got 5 years worth of usage you could have had, and the savings that go alongside that stuff. So it's somebody has to jump at some point. Also, if you think about this digital journey, if you're using a bot on the voice side, so if we're taking these calls and we're automating those calls, and you're talking about your slightly older relative, etc., that's doing that, you've just democratized that service, because you've actually made it digital, because it's a bot that's answering the phone. The fact that your analog voice is doing the serving and processing the process, and you're asked your name and you're filling out a form using your voice, everybody can do that. And
Yes.
that is then you've digitized it anyway, so they don't have to go online. They can do
Oh,
it
okay.
on the phone.
Okay.
So you've just digitized everything because the
Yes.
phone is actually now a digital entry point to your service.
Which is
Okay.
good in two levels, isn't it? Because that also means you've used the example of an elderly person, but it also means people at the more, let's say, younger, but also vulnerable, less well educated end of the spectrum as well in using our public services. They should also be able to cope with
Yes.
that as well.
Yes.
So it will work on multiple levels. But I was also struck, Steve, what you're articulating absolutely rightly, that commissioners aren't asking for it. So we're back to the point Nick was making about bravery, risk taking,
Yeah.
leadership in order to be able to do some things differently in the future.
I mean, I think on an optimistic note, Ben, I suppose I'm aware there's quite a number of local authorities now. I say quite a number, it's probably a small number, but a significant number. And I know this through my work with community catalysts, where local authorities are being brave in developing the bottom-up process that I described at the beginning. In other words, working with community groups. So I think for me, what's coming out of this is that there's a next step challenge about how we do the same with AI, with some of these groups. In other words, there are some authorities that are prepared to be leaders rather than laggards. It's finding those, and I think that's a challenge for me, and that's certainly a challenge for Stephen, because I'm an associate of Steve's as well in his business. So it is one of the things we can perhaps think about, Steve, going forward,
very
in
much
terms of how we it's finding the right ones to
so.
start that
and
trial.
I'm a massive fan of small scale model projects, because sometimes you need the proof of the pudding,
Yes,
the art of the possible. But you need people to be brave enough to do it. And in the climate we're in and are going to be in for a long time, there really isn't any other way to do this. People have to try something different, because doing what we've always done is making life hard.
I think again, one of my concepts that I have in the book is this concept of emergence. In other words, it's not about trying to predetermine everything that comes out. You may have a sense of direction about where you want to go, but actually the best things come by experimenting, trial, letting it emerge, rather than actually specifying in so much detail, like the Ministry of Justice does, that not only this is what we want, but we done it this way on Saturday at 3 o'clock, and then wondering why you ain't going to get any, and you get no satisfaction with people working in the system. I'm conscious of taking this conversation, just checking some things out, Ben. Was there any other takeaways from the book before we kind of start moving towards the end of this episode that you'd like to just
I think we've covered a number of them. I think in that current context we're talking about, having a clear strategy, enabling people and freeing them up and working differently by working in a much more collaborative way, that has to offer us some pointers for a way forward that is part of what we've been doing, but not enough of what we've been doing. And I think your book, when people sit down and read it and work through it properly, you offer us some pointers for how things can be done differently. And we're at that time. We have to do something.
Have to do it differently. Yes, it reminds me this bit of the conversation, Ben, of one of the publications that I read right at the beginning of this journey was by some consultants who had observed some of the early managers in the purchaser provider model of public services. If you go back to the 1980s, 1990s, when Margaret Thatcher first came in, and they just realized by sitting down with these managers that they were even then trying to do things in a very different way. and actually they'd been dealt a hand which was very difficult to deal with in the traditional markets metrics management model that actually they'd been asked to work with, and they had to find very creative ways to work with the turbulence they were encountering as managers. They couldn't dictate what was happening. They had to influence what was happening. It was a different skill set, and it's that skill set is something that we can come back to. I think. Well, I'm certainly going to pick up with some of the other people I talked to in the podcast, but it's one of the things you're going to join us in the last episode, Ben, and
Yes.
I think we could perhaps in that last episode reflect a bit more on skills as well.
Yeah.
So, Steve, was there anything else you wanted to
No, I think
reflect on from this conversation?
I think the getting in front of the right people who are actually they've got the challenges is the key to this. The people are actually doing the work, and they're actually trying to deliver these first line services, no matter what it may be. They have to be involved quite
Yes,
significantly
yes,
because they are the ones that are doing all the fixes, like we
yeah,
said, and so they have a better idea about what a possible more regimented fix would be and where
yes,
the money might well be spent more efficiently, which is exactly what you're saying, really.
yeah.
And we've
And
seen that with the
yeah,
small bits of works that we've been doing,
and I just, I guess for concluding for me, it just takes me back to an article I read in The Guardian just before Christmas from one of the consultants in one of the hospitals in London, who was saying actually a big issue behind the current strikes are, okay, there is a money issue, but it's the way things are done. And he was arguing very strongly, why don't you let us as the practitioners
Yeah,
design services? We will do it efficiently, effectively, in the best interest of the consumers, in the best interest of the public purse.
yeah,
Most of us aren't there. We are there to do a we're there because we care. We're there because we're not okay. We need a salary out of it, but actually we're doing this because we really genuinely care about our communities and our health.
let's go over
Um,
again what our
so
takeaways
I
are.
think
That probably wraps
Steve,
up, is it? Yeah,
yeah, it
I think we've
does.
run over slightly our target of half an hour or whatever it was. But it's a huge subject, so
Yes,
how can we not?
yeah,
So I hope that was very interesting for everybody.
brilliant. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and nice to talk to you, Ben.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Enjoyed it. Thanks very much indeed.
All right, thanks everybody. Cheers.
Takeaways, I think, for me from today are specifically around four things, and they're around brave leadership to lead us into the right strategies for the future. Um, does take that, does take a risk to do that, to do things in a different way, um, to take a risk of working with the views of citizens to design future services.
Yeah,
Certainly to be truly open and authentic in our collaboration with other partners so that we really listen to what they're saying, to what they can contribute, and that we design services that are a much better blend and a much better chance of having an effective outcome.
yeah,
And finally, that we can find those local authorities and other public agencies that are willing to trial on a pilot basis some of the new technology that can really help us in
yeah,
terms of delivering cheaper, more authentic public services. And there's so many issues to consider around that, but I think in the same way that there are authorities I know working and designing services now from the bottom upwards, it's
yeah,
finding another group of authorities that are willing to say, okay, I want to take a risk on this because actually it could benefit us all.
yeah. Absolutely. Thanks very much, Nick. I hope everybody enjoyed that, and look out for the next episode, which is the strategy for direction, starting points, and receptive contexts. Thanks. If you enjoyed that episode, then why not check out the other episodes in the podcast? Thanks very much.